Now we are going
今天的
to
演讲的将是许丽杰博
hear
士，
the keynote
他会与我
speech.
们分
First of
享
all,
时
we
尚
will
产业
have
与
Dr.
气候
Xu
变化的关
Lijie
系，以
to
及
share
能
about
用标
the
准性的
relationship
时
between
尚能
fashion
源
industry
打破
and
产业的
climate
减碳
change
发展。
and
许
how we
丽杰
can
博
use
士在
standard
深圳市
to
大
better
学基
promote
础研
the
究
green
院绿色
development
发展和研
of
究
the
所
fashion
所长、
industry.
环境科学博
Professor
士。
Xu Lijie
他
is the
的本科
director
是
of
标准化的
Institute
网
of
膜
Green
设计，
Development
同时
and
也利用
Environment
技术
of
创新
Shenzhen
应用的
Institute of
艺术家。
Standards
他讲
and
的是节能减
Technology.
排、绿色低碳、
She
可持发
has
展
a lot
等
of
相关标准
experience
化的研
in
究以及应用工
energy
作实践。
saving as well as
先
using
后主持
standards
了科研议
to
题的
promote
20以上，
sustainability.
涵盖城市绿色的发展、
She
气候
has
能源建
held
设、
more
碳
than
排费
10
的全交
projects,
易以及绿色产品体系、
including
能源管理
topics
体系
like
等领域。主
carbon
要研制有
emission
3
rights
项国际
trading
标准以及
and many
40
other
以上环
issues.
境类的国家和地方标准，并且作为主要的编写人，编著了
She
全
has
国首
been
部碳排放和产
the
品管
major
理手
author
册，
of
发表6
China's
本
first
25
manual
篇及
of
88
training
的文章和
personnel
期
in
刊，以
reducing
及全
carbon
球撰
emissions
写了经
and
济
other
和
things.
绿色低碳领域相关技术分析报告等30余篇，为深圳市的100余家企业提供碳核查、能源管
And
理
she
体系建
has
设咨询
offered
以及绿色园
the
区、绿色工厂
consultancy
的评
for
价
more
服
than
务。
100
那接
companies
下
in
来我们
Shenzhen
就有请许
to
丽杰韦
make
博士
their
为我们
operations
做
more
主题演
sustainable.
讲。
Now we give the floor to Professor Xu Lijie to start her keynote speech.
云端的各位朋友，大家下午好。很荣
Dear
幸
friends
能来参
online,
加
greetings
2023
for
国
all of
际
you.
时
I'm
尚
very
时
honored
尚
to
红旗
attend
草场的会议，
2023
与大家一
International
起交流时尚产业如
Fashion
何实现绿
Zero
色
Fur
低碳发
Industry
展。
meeting and talk about how can
今
we
天我将
realize
从时尚
green
与
and
气候变化
sustainable
中
development.
时
Today
尚
I
企
will
业的
talk
主要
about
承诺与行
fashion
动，
and climate
时尚
change,
产品的
fashion
定制定
industry's
价和创
commitment
新，
and
以
actions,
及标
fashion
志地
industry's
区时
carbon
尚产业
footprint
绿色低碳发
evaluations,
展
carbon
方案
labels,
做一个分
as
享。
well as how can we use
随
standard
着
to
人们
make the
物质
fashion
生活质量
industry
的提高，
greener
越
and
来
more
越多的人
sustainable.
喜欢通过
With
服
the
饰设
improvement
计
of
等时
people's
尚元
living
素来表达
standards,
自己，
more
改
of
变
more
自己的
people
个
are
人
willing
品味
to
以及
use
风格。
garments and
快时
other
尚已变为我们
fashionable
当下的时
elements
尚群
to
体，
display their
以快
personal
速时
taste
尚
and
为主要
style.
元素，
Young
以低
people
价很
prefer
多量
fast
产为
fashion
特点，
because it
激发
is
年轻消费
of
者的兴趣。
lower
在这个建
price
筑上
and
满足消费
more
者的需求。
products,
不
and
仅
this
如
can
此，
meet the
二线
young
城市
consumers'
到了每
demands.
周会推
According
出
to
数百件新
statistics,
品，
20 years
而如
ago,
今
Zara
到了
launched
每年
hundreds
推
of new
出1
products
2到
every
2
week,
万多种新品，
while
平
today they
均
can
每周
launch
换
more
2个
than
新货。
20,000
那权威的科学杂
products
志
each
《自
year.
然》研究表明，
We also
全球
have
人均
another
的整体生
statistics
产量
from
在
Nature that
1975
is
年
the
到
global textile
2018年期
production per
间，
capita
从每年的 5.9
actually
公斤增加
increased
到
from
13公斤，
5.9
从
kilograms
全
to
球
13
超过
kilograms
1500 万
between
件的服装被增
1975
减。
and
但在
2018.
我国，
More
每
than
年会有
100
超
billion
过
pieces of clothing are
2600 万件的旧
discarded
衣服被
globally
丢
each
掉。
year.
这
In
些被
China
丢弃的服
alone,
装
more
垃
than
圾，
26
往
million
往只
tons
能
of
被
used
扔进
clothing are
垃圾
thrown
填埋场
away
或者是
each
垃
year,
圾焚烧
and
炉，
those
造成
discarded
巨大的
garments
资源浪费。
always go into landfill
时尚
plants
产
or
业有
waste
着复杂的运
incinerators.
行
This
体
is a
系，
huge
实际
waste.
上，从源
While
头
the
的生
fashion
产
industry has
与
a
供
very
应到
complicated
产品的
system
制
of
造、包
operation,
装、运
we have
输、
a lot
销
of
售、使
procedures
用，
such
这
as
其中每一个环
producing
节
raw
都可能
materials,
产生巨大
producing
的污染。
products, packaging,
联合国环
transportation.
境规划署称，
Every one of
从
those
生产研
procedures
发
can
到
have
产
a
品最
lot of
终销售到
emissions.
生
According
产，
to
一条牛仔裤
UNEP,
的生产
from
需
the
要新
production
鲜
of
丝绒
cotton
是一生血，
to
可以
putting the
排放
product in the
33.4 千
store,
克的二氧化碳当量，
producing a pair of
相当于美
jeans
国每
will
天汽车
emit
行驶110公里。在
33.4
这些排
kilograms
放
of
中，
carbon
有
dioxide
30% 以
equivalent.
上来自于纤维
Among
和
those
织物的生产，
emissions,
另外的
33%
8%
from the
来自
production
丝
of
织、棉
fibers
质
and
和
fabric.
整理牛仔裤。那么
8%
包装、
come
运
from
输和零售
cutting,
占排
sewing
放的
the
16%，
jeans.
最后剩下
Another
的 40%
16%
可能
comes
是
from
消费者的
packaging,
使用，
transportation,
包
and
括了
retailing.
洗涤牛仔裤
And
和
the
制
last
成的保鲜膜。
40% comes from
然
consumer
而，这只
use,
是牛仔
including
裤的一个
washing the
生产。
jeans
那
and
么，瑞典
discarding
科学
it.
家研究发现，一件普通的棉
A
袄
Sweden scientists discovered that an average cotton shirt may release more than 2,000 carbon dioxide equivalents, while a polyester dress can release nearly 17 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And most of our clothes are made of fossil fuel combustion. According to data, the global fashion industry generated about 2.1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. And this is the total of the emissions by France, Germany, and the UK added. If in 2030 we will have 8.5 billion global population, then our consumption of the fashion field will boom. And we will have more energy waste, labor investment, and environmental pollution coming out of this development. The international community attached more importance to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially for the fashion field. And now we're using carbon label as a tool. This will be a future trend. Now let's talk about what are the brands to take the first actions. Well, we have the Kering Group. They have mandated the carbon label for their products, which can tell the consumer the carbon emissions coming from the production of a certain clothes. Well, by 2030, they want to reduce the carbon emissions by 50% for scope 1 and scope 2. And they want to reduce the emissions by 40% in scope 3. Apart from that, HRM and Levi's have also made correspondent commitments. And they have set a goal for scope 1 and scope 2 together, and another goal for scope 3 alone. Well, meanwhile, we see that many brands like Adidas, they also announced that they will
那随着国际上对降低产品温室气体排放量的重视程度不断加深，
Well, now the international community is paying more attention to reduce carbon emissions. That is the same for the fashion field. Therefore, we are using carbon label as a tool to promote this whole process. Now, let's take a look at what are the brands among the first to take actions to reduce carbon emissions. First, we have the Kering Group, which is one of the French luxurious group. It has mandated the addition of carbon labels in their textile industry and their clothes. This is very important. They also promised that using 2015 as a base year, by 2025, they will reduce the carbon emissions by 50% for scope 1 and scope 2. And they will also reduce carbon emissions by 40% for scope 3. Apart from that, HRM and Levi's have also made commitments, but they have selected different time points as their base year. And they have set a target for scope 1 and scope 2 together, and another target for scope 3 alone. So what is scope 1 and 2? That is the carbon emissions coming from the operation of the enterprise itself, while scope 3 refers to the emissions coming out of the whole supply chain. Meanwhile, a lot of companies are taking actions to reduce emissions. For example, the UK leather manufacturer Marmarin has issued Made to Last manifestos through open letter and online campaign. They promise that by 2030, they will make their whole operation recyclable and sustainable. This is for the whole supply chain. And they also promise that by 2035, they will reach net zero emissions. Another one brand is the leisure brand from USA, Allbirds. They want to become the first fashion brand in the world to label its entire product line. And they have use the recycled cardboard to use 90% of its packaging. They promise to reduce its carbon footprint by 50% by 2025 and reach carbon neutral by 2030. Another brand is China's domestic brand, Peacebird. They've promised to reach a net zero emissions for the whole production line, and they want to reach the net zero emissions for scope 1 and scope 2, which is about their own operation. And also by 2030, they want to make all of their products carbon footprint traceable, which means that they will put carbon label on their products to inform the consumers about the carbon emissions coming from the production of a certain clothes. Another brand is Chinese men's clothing brand Hongdou. By 2040, they want to achieve carbon neutral, and they will label all their products with a carbon footprint label. Many other brands have also launched their own specific green product lines. For example, Adidas announced that by 2024, they will use more materials for packaging in collaboration with the brand Allbirds. So from these actions, we can see that many brands, they really focus on raw materials. They want to use the natural materials because that has less emissions. Well, we've talked about a lot of fashion brands, and we identified that they will set specific targets for reducing carbon emissions, specifically for scope 1, 2, and 3. And they also set a time framework. So basically, by a certain time point, they will put carbon labels on all of their products or part of their products. So now I'm going to talk about what is carbon footprint and what is carbon label. So carbon footprint can be a tool for us to calculate the carbon emissions coming from the production of a certain product, including the production of raw material and the real production process. So it can be a very meaningful tool. And carbon footprint has been used by more than 1,000 enterprises around the world. A lot of renowned multinational companies and retailers have proposed their own plan for reaching carbon neutral. They require their suppliers to calculate the carbon footprint in their operation. And now there are 14 countries and regions that have already proposed certain activities or certifications for carbon footprint. And here are some examples. You can see the carbon label in these pictures. Well, you can see the picture on the bottom left. There is a footprint, and inside it was the carbon emissions of making that product. In Paris Agreement signed in 2015, 195 countries have committed that they will control the global temperature rise within 1.5 to 2 Celsius degrees. And many countries already took measures to reduce their carbon emissions. For example, UK, USA, Japan, and Australia, they have already proposed a system for carbon labeling. While the fashion industry's carbon emissions account for 4% of the global total, which is more than that of aviation and shipping industry. And the retailers, brands, product manufacturers, and the factories involved in fashion industry can all emit a lot into the atmosphere, and we really care about this issue. And here is some carbon label examples from Japan, UK, and Thailand. In April 2021, the French National Assembly have passed an amendment to put carbon emission points on their products. And this amendment is first applied in the textile and clothing industry. And we all know that France is known for its great luxurious industry. So this is a very important signal. Basically, they require the brands and producers to inform the consumers about the carbon emissions of making a certain clothes. They also urge the brands to follow national regulations and guidance. Well, let's take a look at how can a brand to evaluate their carbon footprint and what are the processes. First of all, is for raw materials. They can either use natural fibers or synthetic fibers, and there are a lot of things. For example, producing the labels, packagings, and the main fabrics. And then those materials, raw materials, will be delivered to the manufacturer. And they will do cutting, embroidery, sewing, and a lot of other things. For different clothes, they often have different producing procedures, but there are some common things for all the productions. And then we move to the distribution period, which will involve transportation. And later, those products will be delivered to consumers. Consumers will use the clothes. And this can also has certain carbon emissions. And after that, the consumers will possibly discard the garment or clothes. That can also result in more carbon emissions. So basically, for one clothes, the usage of it will account for the most of the carbon emissions. The carbon emissions coming from consumer use will account for 40 to 80% of the total emission. The second largest contributor to carbon emissions in the whole process is producing the raw materials, and this can differ related to different materials used. For example, the greenhouse gas emissions coming from using synthetic fibers and wools is relatively higher, while using cotton or linen can be lower. And apart from that, transportation and a lot of other processes can also have the emissions. We have just mentioned that different fabrics will have different carbon emissions. And here is a picture showing us the difference. You can conclude from this picture that the carbon emissions from using natural fabrics will be less than use synthetic fabrics. And for washing the clothes, different approaches and different temperature used in washing can also affect the carbon emissions. If we use machine washing, then the carbon emissions will be higher. While for a clothes brand to get the carbon footprint evaluation, they have to go through certain processes. First of all, they have to inform what they have used in the production period. And based on that, we can evaluate the carbon emissions they have produced. And all of those data will be put into our evaluation model. Then we can have a result which involves carbon emissions coming from different stages of that product, such as production, transportation, and consumption. Well, now many places are trying to put forward official carbon labels, and different institutions have different labels. Here you can see an example logo, and there is a QR code. So by scanning the QR code, consumers will know how many carbon emissions that product has produced. Well, I've already talked about different places have different carbon labels. Well, for Shenzhen, This is how we do things. So in last year, we have established a work plan to promote the carbon labels. Our goal is by 2025, we will build a public service platform. We will compile the documents for carbon labeling for more than 100 types of goods, and we will build a data set and an evaluation model. And you can see that garments are actually among the first row of products to be included in this work plan. Last of all, I want to talk about how can we reach the carbon neutrality in the fashion industry. There are certain steps for us to follow. First of all, we have to identify our scope and we have to make it very quantified. We've already talked about that. They are scope 1, 2, and 3. So what are those things? Scope 1 and 2 refers to the direct emissions coming from the operation of the enterprise. For example, the energy, thermal power you have used during production. And this is directly linked to an enterprise operation. But scope 3 is kind of different. This involves the whole supply chain. For example, as a clothes company, I want to produce certain products, but I do not have the raw materials, then I will buy raw materials from suppliers. And in this process, there will be emissions. And this falls into the category of scope 3. So scope 3 is related to the carbon emissions coming from the whole supply chain. While we have a clear idea about what is scope 1, 2, 3, then we can begin to set our target and our work plan. I've already shared some of the examples, and all of those companies, they have set specific targets for scope 1, 2, and 3. For example, they might use 2015 as a base year, and then they will say by the time of 2030 or some other year, they will cut the carbon emissions by a certain percent. And I actually encourage companies to use natural materials when producing. And I recommend them to use renewable energies. I also encourage our consumers to wash the clothes by their own hands instead of using a machine, and because this can also cut the emissions. And with all of those tools, we can reach our carbon neutrality and net zero carbon emission goals. And now we can see that there is an international standard for evaluating the carbon emissions. For international community, we use ISO 14064. And for China, we also have our own specific standards. I believe that no matter those kind of standards are for international community or for certain countries, they are based on the same logic. We also need to calculate the carbon footprint of a certain product or a service. For international community, we use the standard of ISO 14067. In Shenzhen, in 2016, we have issued the general principle for carbon footprint of products. While our institute has been helping the fashion industry to calculate their carbon footprints. Under the guidance of Shenzhen Fashion Industry Association, we have provided services to certain brands. You can see on the bottom of this slide, we have a dress. That is from the brand I-type. So this dress actually has a very low carbon emissions, and they have used natural fabrics to make this dress. Even though the raw materials account for 53% of the total carbon emissions of this dress. However, that is still a very low level. And this is very good. And the usage period of this dress will have a even less carbon emissions. We think this is a great example to tell the consumers to reduce carbon emissions while buying certain clothes from the brand. And we also need to conduct a large-scale carbon footprint evaluation and reporting activities. You can see the left picture is one example of UK. We were also commissioned by the Shenzhen Fashion Garment Industry Association to provide technical services for Shenzhen Fashion Week 2023. We have been engaging in calculating the carbon emissions of the fashion industry and certain products. We can say that with the goal of reaching carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, we advocate everyone to focus on the impact of fashion industry on the climate and to make the whole thing better. Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Xu, for her sharing.